What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to be bringing you Rurouni Kenshin, the Reboot, Chapter 1 review entitled The Beginning of the Romantic Tale. Now, before I hop into this review, I think it's going to be a little bit longer than usual. Let me just say this. I was excited as hell to see this. Yes. For those of you who don't know me, one of my first videos I ever put up was a review of the manga Rurouni Kenshin, and I think very highly of that manga. So when I heard that Watsuki Nobuhiro was bringing it back, I was very excited about that. Didn't know what to expect. A lot of rumors and speculations swirling around this manga. Would it be a reboot? Would it be a Gaiden? Some sort of side story? But I'm here to say this, first and foremost. What the hell is going on? This is a reboot, ladies and gentlemen. It's literally an alternate retelling of the manga Rurouni Kenshin. And so let's jump into this to see what my thoughts are and to see what the hell is going on here. First, the aesthetics. The artwork is absolutely boss. Absolutely boss. So unlike Hiroyuki Takei, who's moved towards a sort of skeletal minimalism in his comeback, Watsuki Nobuhiro has really amped his artwork up. The artwork is just much smoother than it was before. The backgrounds are much more detailed. Much more panoramic scenes we get rather than just close-up face shots which sort of obscure and block out the background. Now we get sort of full body shots with the background displayed, which really gives you a sense of the historical period here, because we're talking about 1876 in Japan, which was really a time of great transition from sort of one historical period to another historical period. For those of you who don't know, it was the sort of passing of the Tokugawa shogunate into the Meiji Restoration, which established a central government for all of Japan. And the character designs also. The character designs have been tweaked a little bit. The faces of the characters are a little bit different. So the differences are noticeable, but the character designs aren't different enough so that the characters are unrecognizable. They still have that same similarity, but you can just tell that the character designs have been tweaked just a little bit, especially with the face. And also Kenshin has a scarf now. He didn't have a scarf before, but that's just, a minor detail that I noticed. So now let's hop into this summary and analysis of the first chapter of the Rurouni Kenshin reboot. So we get a little bit of, starting off, we get a little bit of backstory about Kenshin during the Bakumatsu. And for those of you who don't know, the Bakumatsu was a time of basically civil war within Japan. It was the Isshin Shishi versus the Tokugawa shogunate. The Isshin Shishi were the nationalists of Japan. They were the ones who wanted to create a sort of democracy, a republic. Not quite a democracy or a republic, but basically a centralized government. Something that Japan didn't have before, because if you remember, if you ever took Japanese history lessons, you'll remember that the Tokugawa shogunate was a sort of imperial order rather than being representative of a centralized government. And Kenshin Himura was a part of the Isshin Shishi. He wasn't a part of the imperialists. So he was a very big factor in the transition from an imperial order into a sort of centralized government in Japan. So, like I said, the story starts off with this backstory of Kenshin Himura. And one thing right off the bat that I really like about the artwork is that Kenshin Himura is sort of superimposed on a background. He's sort of on top of the panels, and it just looks like he's, a samurai god descending from the heavens. If any of you have ever read Rurouni Kenshin, you would know that that's kind of not an understatement, kind of not an overstatement rather, because that Hiten Mitsurugi style is just absolutely boss. But anyway, it starts off right off the bat with Kenshin using Hiten Mitsurugi Ryu Suisen, I believe, killing 3 members of the Shinsengumi. The Shinsengumi were defenders of the imperial order, defenders of the Tokugawa shogunate, and of course, Kenshin being a part of the Isshin Shishi was up against them. starts right off just, and I mean, he just doesn't kill these guys of the Shinsengumi. He likes cuts their necks in one fell swoop. So he just sort of spins around in that circle, necks cut, everything. Then we see that he crosses swords with Janae and Hajime Saito. Akusoku Zan. Slay evil immediately. Yes, that's Saito Hajime. And this fight is really, really intense. And so Kenshin now is fighting with Janae, and it's really, really brutal. The fight is so brutal that Kenshin stabs through one person's body to get to Janae and winds up stabbing him through his hands. I mean, this fight is badass and it's brutal. I mean, this is right off the bat. And then at the end of the fight, which is a part of a lot of which is really a part of the psychological symbolism of the Rurouni Kenshin manga. If you know about the manga, at the end of the fight, Kenshin is just standing there in a pool of blood. And blood in Rurouni Kenshin has always been a very important symbol for Kenshin's sort of psychological instability. Because if you've read the previous manga, you'll note that Kenshin, for a large part of the beginning of the manga, he has to battle with Battousai, the manslayer, inside of him. So battle with his instincts to kill and try to suppress them in order to not kill again, in order to not revert back into a manslayer. And that pool of blood is very important psychological symbolism for his sort of, psychological instability and his psychological turmoil. Just to go on a quick tangent here about the translation, I read this from spectrum.net. This is the website that I read this chapter from, and I really, really like the translation because they really kept the flavor of Kenshin Himura's speech. And for those of you who don't know Japanese, just very quickly, Japanese has different systems of speech. So there's different ways of talking to people based on their social standing and based on your own social standing. And this is known as keigo, or honorific speech. So basically, if you're talking in relation to someone who's above you in social standing, there's a particular way you have to speak to them. And if you're talking to someone who's below you in social standing, there's a particular way that you have to speak to them and that they have to speak to you in turn. So one interesting way that this manifests itself in the Japanese language is in the first person pronoun, I. So watashi in Japanese means I, but boku also means I. Watashi is just a general term that anybody can use, meaning I or myself. Boku is a term that's generally reserved for men, and it means I or myself once again. But seisha is a part of keigo, or honorific speech, and Kenshin uses seisha. And what it means is that it's a very, very formal way of speaking about oneself in the first person. And so what Kenshin often does when he speaks is that he'll humble himself before a person as a way of showing his respect, or as a way of showing his humility or honor for the person he's speaking to. And I really like the translation that Spectrum.net uses, which is of seisha, which is this lowly self, because it's a way of lowering yourself in the eyes of someone else that you're trying to raise up and show your respect for. So I really like that, but that's a little bit of a tangent there. Then to get on with the summary, we see how in this alternate retelling of the manga, we see how Kenshin and Yahiko meet. So basically what happens is that Yahiko sees Kenshin walking down the street, and he just kicks him right in the head, and that's some of the the comedy that Watsuki Nobuhiro uses. And then we hear the characteristic Oro from Kenshin. And so, like I said, Yahiko, fly kicks him in the head, and then he drags him back to this arena to participate in a duel. And we find that the person he's supposed to be dueling with is none other than Kamiya Kaoru. And let me just say, the artwork is very, very superb. For her first introduction, I really, really, really love the artwork. You can just really tell that Watsuki Nobuhiro's artwork has really evolved over the years, and that he's gotten much, much, much more comfortable with drawing. And I just really love the way Kamiya Kaoru, when she was first introduced, the artwork that was used to portray her. So basically, Yahiko wants Kenshin to pretend to be the Battousai, the manslayer, so that he can fight against Kamiya Kaoru. And we're really not giving any context at this point in time, but we know that he wants Kenshin to pretend to be Battousai. And this is a little bit of dramatic irony. And dramatic irony is a technique that authors use. It happens when a viewer or a reader has some important information that the characters in that narrative don't have. And it's generally used for a comedic effect, especially in this situation because Yahiko wants Kenshin to pretend to be Battousai the manslayer, but we already know that he's in fact Battousai the manslayer. And so one thing that we learn to sort of add context to this situation is that these fights, these duels are being sponsored by Kanryu Takeda. And this is a very, very significant change in the story. Originally, Kanryu Takeda wasn't introduced until Megumi Takani, if I remember correctly, that was her name, and the Oni Wabanshu were introduced into the storyline. But this time, in this alternate retelling, that's been cut out. So there's no Megumi Takani, there's no Oni Wabanshu, and Kanryu Takeda is not into drugs in this alternate retelling, but he's still a weapons merchant. And what's interesting is that he's sort of taken over the role of the Hiruma brothers. If you remember, the Hiruma brothers were the ones who wanted to exact revenge on Kamiya Kaoru. One of the brothers had his thumb broken by the headmaster of the school, who was Kamiya Kaoru's father, and he wanted to get revenge by destroying the reputation of the dojo. But in this alternate retelling, Kanryu Takeda wants to take over the dojo, and we'll learn about that a little bit later on. But basically, what happens is that Kanryu bought the land rights, the right to the land on which Kamiya Kaoru's dojo is located. And what he wants to do is he wants to use that dojo as a secret store, as a secret warehouse for all of his weapons, because again, he's a weapons merchant. And Kanryu doesn't really want to force her off the land because, you know, he's a businessman. And he doesn't really want to raise suspicion by taking over land that doesn't seem all that valuable. And so what happens is Kanryu and Kamiya Kaoru come to some sort of arrangement. And basically, Kamiya Kaoru has to win 10 duels in a row. And if she wins those 10 duels, she gets to remain in the dojo. And Yahiko, as opposed to the last time, in the last manga, Yahiko is now working with Kanryu Takeda. But it's a little bit interesting here because Yahiko is really a hostage. And there's this unspoken sort of understanding between Kaoru and Kanryu Takeda. Because if Kaoru doesn't go through with the arrangement, then the unspoken understanding is that Kanryu Takeda will probably do some bad things to Yahiko. So Kaoru is kind of forced into this arrangement. And basically what we see here is that not only is Kamiya Kaoru participating in these duels being sponsored by Kanryu Takeda, but we also see that Kanryu Takeda is sponsoring, you know, other fights, other duels. And we can really see the cultural impact of westernization, which is something that we saw a little bit in the last manga, but not to this extent. It really shows that the era of the samurai is over, and that samurais are slowly but surely becoming obsolete, and so now they have to engage in these sort of duels in order to make their living. And the Kamiya Kashin school is also struggling. And so we get to really see the cultural impact of westernization and of the transition from sort of a feudal period into a more centralized governmental reign in Japan. So anyway, Kaoru and Kenshin square off and they're about to duel. And it's really funny because Kenshin, of course, he's fighting against his manslayer. He doesn't want to draw his sword. And so what happens is Kaoru sort of knocks him on the head, knocks him out, and basically one fell swoop in one blow. And then after that, Kenshin goes back to where Kaoru is staying, and Yahiko is also there. His, you know, job is sort of to watch over Kaoru to make sure she doesn't renege on this arrangement between her and Kanryu Takeda. And there's a very interesting discussion here because they're talking about the past, the present, and the future. And Kaoru is talking to Yahiko, and she's talking to him, and she basically tells him that you don't have to worry about your past. What you have to worry about is creating a better future for yourself. And of course, this is more dramatic irony on Watsuki Nobuhiro's for Watsuki Nobuhiro, because it's very serious, and we understand that they don't know that Kenshin is Battousai yet. And so as the viewer or the reader, we understand how important this is for Kenshin Himura, because he wants to sort of use the present to reconcile himself with his past as Battousai the manslayer, and through that reconciliation create a better future for himself, one in which he does not have to revert to the manslayer in order to protect himself, to protect his friends, and to sort of keep this era of peace that he's worked so hard to establish. It is also symbolic of, new possibilities and new hope that the future can, always be better. And one thing that I didn't realize before about Kenshin's relationship to Tomoe, Tomoe is from the previous manga, and his relationship to Kaoru, and specifically within the old manga, is that, and this is, sort of a tangent, but this is also sort of an epiphany on my part. Tomoe was a very important symbol for Kenshin during the Bakumatsu, and it was very interesting, because the metaphor that Watsuki Nobuhiro used was that Kenshin was like the blade and Tomoe was like the sheath, basically stabilizing him, making sure that his psychological instability didn't get out of hand, so that he didn't descend into madness or craziness or insanity. And one thing I noticed in reading this chapter is that although Tomoe, I don't want to spoil anything, but Tomoe is sort of gone out the manga by the time he meets um, Kamiya Kaoru. Even though she's gone, Kamiya Kaoru continues to be that symbol of hope. She continues to be a sheath to Kenshin Himura's blade. And another thing that I noticed was that this raises very interesting questions about the place of femininity within the Rurouni Kenshin manga. Because it's always through some sort of female agency or some sort of female power that Kenshin is able to attain some sort of psychological stability. In one part of the manga, it's Tomoe, and in another part of the manga, it's Kamiya Kaoru. So I thought that was also very interesting. And also another very important symbolism in this reboot, this first chapter, was on page 24, I believe it was, at least on the Spectrum.net scanlation, on page 24, Kenshin, after he leaves Kamiya Kaoru, he's sort of standing. There's this shot where he's standing and he's looking up at the sky, and you can just see all the stars in the night sky. And this is really symbolic. Anytime you see this in any sort of manga or comic book, this is what that symbolism generally means. It's there to sort of connote a sort of the insignificance of human life, but it's also there to connote the fact that human beings always have the ability to give their lives meaning and purpose. That even though there's no metaphysical purpose in the universe, that human beings have the obligation or the responsibility to give their lives meaning and purpose, even if in comparison to the entire universe their life may be somewhat insignificant. So I really like that symbolism on page 24. And also, this conversation between Kaoru and Kenshin was very, very serious. But I like the fact that it had some comedic elements as well. When Kaoru she knocked him on the head when she beat him in that duel, and then Kenshin is sort of sitting down, and Kaoru is standing over him, and she's rubbing some medicine on his head, and Kenshin's acting like a little punk, even though we all know he's Battousai the manslayer. So I like that nice interplay between seriousness and comedy. And that's one thing that was really carried over from the last manga and this manga. And I think the art style also reflects that. And the transitions in the art style are very fluid to reflect this interplay between comedy and seriousness. So I really like that. But as the story goes on in the first chapter, there's some new developments in the arrangements between Kamiya Kaoru and Kanryu Takeda. So Kanryu Takeda, after Kaoru has gone through 9 duels, remember she has to get through 10. uh, Kanryu sort of switches things up a little bit, and he says, "You know what? I want you to participate in these night matches, not in the regular duels that happen in daytime, but in some night matches. A night that happens at a match that happens at night at my mansion." And this is sort of foreshadowing because we already know that something fishy is going on, and Kenshin's trying to get to the bottom of it. So when Kanryu Takeda tells Kaoru this, Kenshin goes after Kanryu's bodyguard, and the bodyguard of Kanryu Takeda is pretending to be Battousai, the manslayer. But Kenshin confronts Kanryu Takeda's bodyguard to get some more information on precisely what's happening and why Kanryu Takeda seems to want Kamiya Kaoru's dojo. And he gets very serious, and when Kenshin Himura gets serious, we all know what happens. Basically, the bodyguard gets his ass whooped. The fight isn't that dramatic because Kenshin is able to impose himself very, very quickly. You can tell because his eyes sort of change, his facial expressions change. And basically, he interrogates Kanryu Takeda's bodyguard, and he finds out what Kanryu Takeda is planning to do in these night matches and why it is that he wants Kamiya Kaoru's dojo. So Kenshin goes to look for Yahiko to make sure he's safe. And Kenshin asks Yahiko, do you need some help? Because Kanryu Takeda has, beat up Yahiko, and you can learn about all of the specific details of why that happened. But basically, Kenshin finds Yahiko and asks him, do you need any help? And one thing that I didn't like about this is that Watsuki Nobuhiro seems to have changed Yahiko's personality. And so when Kenshin asks him if he needs help, Yahiko immediately just says, "Yes, I need some help." But the old Yahiko from the old manga never would have admitted to this so easily. Even if he would have eventually admitted it, he never would have admitted it this easily, because the Yahiko of the last manga was very, very prideful. And this was something I didn't like about the way he tweaked Yahiko's personality, but that's just me personally. But anyway, Kanryu Takeda is now fighting with Kaoru in these night matches, and what we find is that it's going to be 3 or 4 samurai against Kanryu Takeda, and it's very, very weird because as he's fighting against these 3 or 4 samurai, including Kamiya Kaoru, he pulls out a Gatling gun. Yeah, it gets that serious. He pulls out a Gatling gun. And if any of you remember the last series, he also used the Gatling gun against the Oniwabanshu. And what was very, very weird and something that I really didn't like about this aspect of the chapter was that it's sort of comedic on one hand, but it's also serious and psychopathic on another hand. So while Kanryu Takeda is shooting at these people and he manages to kill a couple of them, it begins to be somewhat of a joke because Kanryu Takeda is making jokes, he's laughing, he's, doing all these weird and funny poses. So it's like sort of Watsuki is mocking Kanryu Takeda on one hand, but on the other hand, he's having him kill people. And that juxtaposition between comedy and seriousness in this instance, really made me feel uncomfortable, and it was just really, really awkward. Really, really awkward style clash. But basically, Kenshin comes to save the day, to save Kamiya Kaoru, and he whoops Kanryu Takeda's ass, basically. And at some point, I forget precisely what page this was on, but we see another instance of Kenshin standing in a pool of blood. And so that symbolism of blood, that pool of blood, returns when Kenshin goes to face off against Kanryu Takeda, and it's basically indicative of the fact that whenever a Kenshin gets serious and you see that, the symbolism of the pool of blood, he's about to revert back into Battousai the manslayer. But Kenshin, like I said, he saves Kaoru, he saves Yahiko, he beats Kanryu Takeda's ass, and at the end, He reveals to Yahiko and Kaoru, I think he reveals to them more, they find out some way that Kenshin Himura is actually Battousai the manslayer. But the real twist comes at the end of the chapter, in the last maybe 2 or 3 pages. So after Kanryu Takeda gets beat up by Kenshin, and he gets arrested. Of course, he's rich, so he finds a way to get out of jail. He then goes to hire some help to defeat Kenshin, to get revenge on Kenshin. Now, in the original manga, we know that the Haruma brothers hired Sanosuke Sagara, Zanza, the fighter for hire, and he was the one who fought Kenshin, to get revenge for the Haruma brothers. But now we see Kanryu Takeda has hired people to kill Kenshin, but it's not just anybody. He's hired Sanosuke, he's hired Hajime Saito, and even some villains from the Jinchu arc. So I started asking myself, what the hell is going on here? I mean, so when I say this is a reboot, and when I say this is an alternate retelling, this is literally an alternate retelling. We get to see characters who are not supposed to show up until the Jinchu arc, showing up in the last pages of the very first chapter. So that's a hell of a twist, and that's something that I really, really was not expecting. And then all the way in the background, and this is sort of foreshadowed in the beginning because, like I said, Janae was fighting against Kenshin in the very beginning of the manga. We see all the way in the back of the crowd Janae. And so perhaps this is foreshadowing of the Janae arc that we saw in the first manga, and that was depicted a little bit fillerishly, if that's a word, fillerishly, in the anime. So perhaps this is foreshadowing that Kenshin and Janae are about to meet up again and duke it out. But again, I don't know what's happening with Sanosuke, what's happening with Hajime Saito, what's happening with the villains from the Jinchu arc. Very, very weird stuff going on. But my initial reaction and my initial thoughts to this reboot was that the artwork is boss, very good, definitely better than the first time around. That I like the interplay between comedy and seriousness. And I think that so far so good, it's okay, but I'm just really interested to see what's going to happen later on. And so we'll see what happens. So this was your boy Ubi Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.